Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.
From Buffalo Toronto Public Media, this is What's Next, an hour dedicated to amplifying the voices of marginalized and underrepresented communities across Western New York and Southern Ontario.
We cannot erase, we cannot reform, we cannot make things better if we're uncomfortable having tough conversations,
Absolutely.
if we're uncomfortable talking about race.
What's Next carries forward our mission to engage in meaningful conversations about race, equity, and the shared concerns that deeply affect Buffalo's East Side and beyond.
Don't stop. Make those families part of your life. Their lives are part of yours. Don't stop.
Together, we dive into the real issues, striving for understanding, connection, and change.
In the suburban area, everywhere, we must work and teach our children.
And good morning. This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR. My name is Jay Moran. For the next hour on What's Next, we're going to look at the gender pay gap, and specifically here in Erie County, a recent report called Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success. That is the report. It was commissioned by the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. And with us, we have Karen King. Karen is the Commissioner of Public Advocacy and Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Jay.
Also with us, the two authors of this particular report, Cathy Creighton, who is the Director, ILR Buffalo, CoLab, Cornell University. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Jay.
And also with us, Rusty Weaver, Director of Research, ILR Buffalo, CoLab, Cornell University. Rusty, good to have you back.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so there's a lot to get into here. Let's let Karen perhaps give us a bit of an overview to start things off here. The concept behind this, because there's a lot to it. It's not just numbers. Focus groups were involved in this as well. Give us how that all came to pass.
Well, what we were really interested in doing is providing a narrative about women's experience with work outside the home, wage work. And of course, that would involve statistics about earnings and median incomes and professions, which is always important. But what was elemental to this particular report was to center women's stories. And that's why the focus group component was so important, because we really think that women have a lot of stories to share. They aren't often given an opportunity to be in a space to share them. And a lot of important, rich data comes out of these discussions, which inform the report. So we wanted the report to reflect the region as well. A lot of pay gap reports, particularly in New York State, reflect data in the aggregate. And they don't really tell a bigger story. They'll tell you what the pay gap is or what women earn on the dollar compared to men, but they don't tell you the story behind it. And we want to find out, we wanted to hear what conditions women are dealing with. Are they still dealing with sexual harassment? Are they still challenged by work-life balance? Are they being promoted? Are they given opportunities for promotions? Do they like their work? What type of work are they doing? All of those things come to bear in a focus group setting in different ways than a survey. So that's why it was important to do both.
And when it comes to numbers, we should start right off with the idea that you released this report on Equal Pay Day, right? March 25th.
All Women's Equal Pay Day, correct.
Explain what that means.
Well, that's just the aggregate percentage of all women, and then it's broken down throughout the calendar year when we look at ethnicity and occupation. That is just the data that's culled from all working women. I think, what is the age, Rusty? 16 to 65, working in the United States full-time.
Right. So it takes till March 25th
of the following year
for a woman
to be in pay parity with white men.
Gotcha. Okay, and if we break, I mean, just to go through a couple of them, just to break it down: Black women, July 10th; disabled women, October 23rd; Native women, November 18th. Let's talk about the focus groups. This is an interesting part of this. I mean, obviously the numbers are always fascinating. We're going to get into this, but this does bring a little color to this report. Talk about the women who were involved in these focus groups.
So what we did, Jay, was we did a call out to women, and it's called a snowballing effect, where you hope that some women contact other women, a call to come to focus groups where women could talk about their work-life experiences. And so we held 5 focus groups from October through December of 2024. We had various kinds of women come to the focus groups, women who work in the education field from childcare through college administration. We had healthcare workers, service workers, and public sector workers primarily, and not-for-profit workers. So we had these women come together, and we asked them all sort of the same genre of questions. And those questions were like, what are your motivations for working? Number one. And then when you're at work, what's your experience with your pay and benefits and your supervisory structure at work? And then what's the climate of your working environment? Are you experiencing discrimination or harassment, et cetera, or not? And then finally, what are the challenges that you're facing between your work life and your home life? Is there a work-life balance that you're achieving? So we had these focus groups, and they were quite amazing. Rusty and I met with women, and once they were given like free rein to talk, it sort of was a little bit at first. There were some reticence, but then they really got going, and we could talk about what we found. But just before we talk about what the facts were, we heard from many women that they really enjoyed having this opportunity to come together to talk with other women. They found that just so like almost exhilarating and rewarding and satisfying. And they hoped that maybe Karen will facilitate many kind of women's groups where women can come together and talk about almost like a group therapy. Like, I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. Other people are experiencing what I'm experiencing. So
that's what you got from that they're just glad to have this opportunity to hear, and things came out. I mean, I'm curious. There's so much that we can get into here, but let's say there were people who were maybe executives involved in this, and perhaps maybe more ground level workers involved. They kind of seem to bond in that way, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Oh yeah, really, they really bonded, and maybe Rusty can. I don't know if you want to. You were there with me. What
would you see?
So as Cathy described it, it really pointed to, and one of the recommendations we even have at the end of the report focuses on institution building and network building, because it did seem like a transformative experience for a lot of the women who were able to participate. But to your point, we did mix rooms. There were tenured professors in the same room as childcare workers who are at very opposite ends of the pay scale. Folks who might not interact on a regular basis were in the same space talking about the same issues and realizing that they weren't I problems that they were having, they were we problems. It's just like in an organizing sense, when you think that you're alone in something, having that feedback from others and seeing that your experience plays out in different types of settings over time and across space, I think was really powerful. And it's often the case that institutions are built and they're voluntary and they fade away really fast because that focusing moment goes away. But I don't think it would with this, because the women that participated in these studies were very adamant that they would like to see something like this happen again, and that they would have continued participation. As Cathy said, it was somewhat therapeutic, but I also think it was the germ of change, because one thing that folks reflected on a lot is that while women are in the positions that are driving a lot of our frontline work or a lot of our essential services, they're not the ones making the decisions in those settings. And so that change in decision-making power became a theme that we saw recurringly, that unless women who care about other women and are in these spaces are the ones making decisions, they're not expecting to see a lot of change.
And I think it's important to highlight the very nature of the focus group offered anonymity.
Okay.
And I think that frees up a person's ability to share if they know it's going to be confidential and no one knows who's saying it. Because as we know in the workplace, it's a hierarchical structure and it's a very, very structured system. And people are very mindful of what they say and to whom they say it to. So I think this idea of Cathy saying liberating, it makes sense because we provided a space, a quote, safe space for women to share stories that they may not have never shared before. or certainly would only share in a very select group. So there's power in that. This idea of collective power, of sharing stories, that the CEO or the C-suite has the same concerns or same challenges, not exclusively, but similar to a woman just entering the workplace. That's a very powerful thing. So I'm not surprised that there was an overwhelming interest to continue the conversation, because I don't think women are asked very often what they think.
You kind of stole my thunder to a certain extent, but the idea that would it be beneficial for an organization, let's say like Buffalo Toronto Public Media, right, to have their women workers, women executives to get together, but like you said, a hierarchical situation maybe changes what might come out in some conversation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tricky, Jay. I think it really depends on the room.
I'm not sure how honest I'd be in that myself.
You'd have to have it outside your own workplace, perhaps group settings.
But it really illustrates the point of how important and empowering it is to give voice to the women's work experience.
Absolutely. We are talking about the report, Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success here in Erie County when it comes to women in the workplace. Now, talk about history. Things have changed considerably for women in the last half century or so. I think I saw in the report there was, not all that long ago, women could get credit cards. I find that almost a stunning reality. But so a lot has changed, right? But where we are right now, though, women in the workplace about the same as men in the workplace in terms of just numbers, right?
Yeah, so I mean, here in Erie County, especially going back to 60s and 70s, the gap in participation in the labor force was 40% or more. So if 70% of men are participating, 30% of women were. And that has changed considerably and very fast, given that that's sort of a slow churn and a generational thing. The labor force participation gap in Erie County right now is less than 7%. So women are participating at about the same rate as men. Now, however, one thing that we learned in the focus groups especially is that care burdens still fall disproportionately on women. So they're also working as much as their male counterparts, but then taking care of the homestead as well and doing all of the necessary care work. And so burnout is real. And I'd say everyone that we spoke to in all of the focus groups acknowledged that burnout is real. But where that hasn't translated into big changes, while women's participation in the labor force has increased and nearly equaled men, their wages, of course, haven't. And that's a lot of the crux of this report is that the top industries in Erie County right now are health and social services and educational services.
In terms of numbers.
In terms of numbers, absolute numbers of jobs. And those two industries are dominated by women. 75% in the case of health and social services, 66% in the case of educational services. So our two biggest industries in terms of numbers are being run and driven, or I shouldn't say run, they're being driven by women. But what we're learning in the focus groups is really run by men. And so what we see is whereas women might be 75% of the workforce in health and social services, they only earn 60% of the wages. Right?
Yeah.
And only serve in a much smaller percentage of leadership roles because they're running it. They're just not being acknowledged and compensated, with the title and the pay and the power that comes with that.
And so in the focus groups, I'm wondering if women felt that because they have that child care, I guess, burden, I think was the word that was being termed, that it was holding them back, whether it was keeping them from perhaps, doing what they needed to do to get up the ladder, so to speak, or is it just, again, perception, a real place perception that, you're a mom. I mean, how could you lead this organization? Which I think in my household, I would find it quite a bit different, actually, but that's another story.
I think there's a few things going on. So one is once a woman is inside the workplace, and they are looking for promotional opportunities. First, I will say that women are fully aware, and every focus group, every woman we talk to, they are fully aware that they are receiving unequal pay, that they are not being promoted at the same rate as men, and they understand that they're doing work that is kind of women's work and less valued. So women are fully aware of these things inside their workplace.
Okay.
So inside the workplace, when women go for promotions, that it was reported they're often overlooked. And in some instances, women report that people, even though they were qualified for promotion, that the employer brought in someone from outside the organization to be the supervisor. And then to just add icing on the cake, they had to train those supervisors in the work that they were doing. And they weren't given the promotion, but they're training the person who got the promotion from outside the organization.
And that was common inside these focus groups.
That we heard that a number of times. And we heard many different things like that. Women in organizations take on committee work, for example, because they are more collaborative and they get involved. And so they do the committee work. So it's extra work that they're performing inside the organization. Women said that in order to get recognized inside their workplaces, they almost invariably worked harder than the men in the workplace. They felt they worked much harder than men. They had to be much more prepared. They had to be more qualified. They also had to be very loud in their actual physical voices to be heard. Some women reported that it's not their inclination, but they have to speak louder so that they're heard over men that they work with, and that these things are very exhausting inside their workplace. And we could talk a little bit later about what happens at home, but inside the workplace, they're striving for promotions. They're not getting them. They're doing more work than the men that they're working alongside. They feel more qualified. They work harder. They're more prepared, and yet they're not achieving promotional status.
And Rusty, you put together a database as well when it just comes to breaking down different occupations, men versus women. And I think perhaps maybe, I don't know if you have it in front of you, but I think surgeon, you told me about this before, and Cathy may have mentioned this before. If you put in surgeon, we're in an area where you'd think would be empirical, right? A qualified surgeon is a qualified surgeon, yet women, far less.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a gap in median wages of over $20 per hour when you account for the number of hours worked.
Wow.
In that particular occupation. But in the report, we do focus on occupational categories because any given occupation can have a ton of variability with it. So
Sure.
By focusing on occupational categories, we tried to get rid of some of that noise. And the approach that we took with the quantitative analysis of wages was not just to look at median earnings by occupational category and compare men to women, because that's kind of an apples to oranges comparison. If you're not working the same number of hours, if you're not in the same position, as Dr. King said, a lot of women, especially in Erie County, are concentrated in, they might be in a specific industry, but they're in lower paying roles in those industries. And so we wanted to make sure that we were accounting for all of those differences. And so we used statistical methods of regression analysis to be able to take wages and try to decompose them into all of these factors that contribute to wages: age, experience, education level, specific occupation, industry, public versus private sector, and a whole host of other variables, including whether or not they have children present in the household, the type of household they live in, and all of that, so that we could cancel out all of those effects and see what's left, what's still standing when we compare wages between like occupations. And in every occupational category in the region, there's a statistically significant pay gap in average earnings between men and women. And the largest one is in our biggest industry, in health and social services, where the pay gap per hour, I do have that in front of me, is nearly $6 per hour after controlling for all of those factors. In general,
in this massive industry here in Western New York.
For sure, yes, exactly. And
that is dominated by women in terms of number of employees.
Right. And that's looking at specifically the healthcare practitioners as well. So it goes to the question of surgeons, doctors, those positions where you assume folks have the same credentials. And then when you do account for their hours worked and their education and all of that, what's left is still a very significant pay gap. And the overall pay gap, when we just look at all women in the workforce, was about $2.74 per hour. So women are earning about 88 to 90 cents for every dollar that men earn, which is consistent with some other reports at the New York State level. But again, in those healthcare practitioner occupations, that goes up to nearly $6 per hour. In professional and legal services, it's about $5. So even when women are getting into these higher level positions, they're still earning less. And to Cathy's point, we did speak with a lot of executive level women in higher earnings positions, and they were well aware of this. We had a woman specifically who was in higher education, in a role where she got has access to budgets because she is a budget director,
Okay.
and a very similar type of person who had far less experience, who had came on. She had been with the organization for over a decade. This gentleman with the same education, less experience, came in and immediately started earning about $30,000 more than her per year. And so we see the data, and then we've heard stories to corroborate that data. And so it seems like, again, this is a problem that despite all of the gains in labor force participation, we're not seeing the same level of improvement in wages. Wages have gone up, just not by the same that they have for men.
It's startling to hear that, to talk about the budget director who had a chance to see the salaries.
I wanted to give her the number of an employment attorney to sue on an Equal Pay Act case. Yeah,
but at the same time, the expression of in these focus groups, how did they feel about that? I mean, is it they just accept it and they know they have to work harder, or are these individuals just really, really? I know how I would feel about it. I'm embittered about it. There's no doubt about it.
They're not happy.
Okay.
They're well aware of it. They're not happy. Employers really try and keep wage data secret.
Right.
So this person could find out that Rusty was talking about. She knew because she could see the numbers, but most women can't see the numbers. And that is a suggestion that we have, is that really employers should be forced to have open source data on the wages that they pay their employees. There are some laws that are currently in effect, but they're really not terribly strong. They give wage ranges, but not actual numbers. And women fully understand this, but they're mad and they want to seek redress for it, and they're working towards trying to make a change. And I think the focus group, that gets back to what Rusty was saying, the germ of change. I really love that expression, Rusty. I really, really like that.
I'm going to put it on a T-shirt. And
the germ of change.
Yeah.
So it was, but you see how, like, when employers try and keep things closed and data unavailable, and employees not talking to each other about their wages, that's the opposite of what the focus groups were. The focus groups were where women could come together and express this, and other women were like outraged by it, in support of you, and you feel like you're not alone. So I think that's where Karen's nodding here. Yeah.
Well, I think it's important to stress the importance, of legislative change, legislative enforcement. If there's a law in the books, it's got to have teeth. The onus shouldn't solely rest on the employee who feels that they're being discriminated against or experiencing wage theft or wage discrimination. And up till now, it really, the onus has been on the employee, and there has to be more, as I said, teeth attached to the legislation. And that's a whole other discussion on the complexity of how laws come to be. So you really need a lot of stakeholders at the table, because we're not just talking about the redress of wage discrimination. We're talking about a larger cultural change and a cultural shift in terms of attitudes. You mentioned, childcare or caregiving, and we call it the caregiving penalty, that women seem to be penalized for being caregivers of their families. Children, aging parents. It shouldn't be a penalty. It should be something that they're rewarded for. But because our society is organized around certain values that say, well, if you want to have children, then you're going to have to step out of the workplace and you're going to lose your place. It doesn't have to be that way, but we design systems that are still really entrenched in patriarchy. And I think that's at the root of most of these discussions, and reflective in the comments that the women have made and the data. And that's a big issue to tackle, but it has to be tackled on many fronts. Business owners, politicians, grassroots organizers, all have to be invested in lifting up women's economic power.
I'm wondering also, though, in the focus groups, if you did maybe come across individuals who in their workplace found they were a little more of that germ of change, so to speak. There was a little more of a progressive attitude toward women in their workplace, and that maybe the workplace was benefiting from it. Or did we not find that? Or maybe we just don't have places like that in Western New York.
Are you thinking of the service sector? argument?
No, that's a good one to circle back to. But I was going to say, so one individual who did participate in the focus groups, who consults heavily with both the public sector and the nonprofit sector on grant writing and things of this sort, ran a firm that has expanded recently, and she is a woman owner of her business and has made it a priority to pay high wages, to pay living wages, to allow remote work, and to have flexible opportunities for her predominantly female workforce, because she understands these same issues. And so that's a case in point of a woman being in a position of power, in a leadership role, understanding what her employees are probably going through since she has had the same experiences, and changing the structure and organization of that workplace so that women can benefit. And she had nothing but positive things to say about all of her workers, who her retention rate is very high. She doesn't lose a lot of employees, and she recently expanded in this economy where we don't see a ton of expansion, especially in smaller businesses that are relying on grant funds. So that's a positive story, I think, that we took away from that.
Yeah, I hope she's listening. We could say right on.
Let's use that as a chance to take a time out on our discussion. We're talking about the gender pay gap, specifically here in Erie County, a recent report called Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success. We have the two authors with us, Cathy Creighton and Rusty Weaver, and also Karen King from the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. We'll take a time out. This is What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
Buffalo Toronto Public Media produced a short documentary on creative restorations, which delivers life-saving supplies to combat overdose in Western New York.
Because we're a new agency, what happens sometimes is, a lot of grant funders, they are hesitant to fund you. So we were on the fence with getting the grant before I sent them the video. It was able to show the grant funder what exactly their money was going to go towards. With that grant, that allowed us to secure a home base. Now we have a location where we do community meals, where we provide services right then and there. So I think the importance is you guys were able to really put boots on the ground with us, really show the city in a lens that you don't commonly see. So I think it helps to raise awareness to some of the issues that we have in our city, but also what else left do we have to do as a community to better our community. Please, if you can, fund public media, make sure that they're available, because they really put a harder focus on the community, and it really gives a better view of what we really need to get done here.
Contact Congress now at protectmypublicmedia.org.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the BTPM Listen app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using what'snext@btpm.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
And I'd like to think we're having a lively conversation today on What's Next. With this, we have Karen King. Karen is the Commissioner of Public Advocacy and Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Also, Cathy Creighton, Director, ILR Buffalo CoLab, Cornell University. Rusty Weaver, Director of Research, ILR Buffalo CoLab, Cornell University. They're the co-authors of the report Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success. We were getting into what we, I guess, called the motherhood penalty or the caregiver penalty when it comes to the workplace. Let's get into maybe some numbers, and let's maybe get into what we've heard from our focus groups as well when it comes to this. What can you tell us?
Sure. So I know we covered the way that we arrived at a lot of these numbers before, but again, we tried to find the pay gap between folks who are doing similar work, who have the same occupational background, the same credentials, and all of that. But then we also looked in at key focal variables of how we could estimate average wages between men and women in those roles to see if there were key variables or factors that really stood out as potentially drivers or at least non-random associations here with the pay gap. And so the overall gap, like we mentioned in overall earnings for all workers, is about $274 per hour. So women on average are earning about $274 per hour less than men in similar roles and situations. But when we looked at specifically families or persons who are raising their own children as part of a couple, it could be a married couple or a same-sex household couple, when we look at the parents in those situations, men on average are, and again, controlling for all of those other relevant factors, are earning about $28.13 per hour compared to women who are at less than $25 per hour. So the gap there is almost $3.20 per hour. these cases don't happen often, but imagine that a man and a woman, a husband and wife, are raising their own kids in the exact same job. They went through the same schooling and everything. They're the same people. The dad is earning about $3.20 per hour more than the mom, even though they're doing the same work. And then that coupled with when we did focus groups of folks, we already talked about how women recognize that they're also disproportionately doing the care work at home too. So they're being penalized, I want to say once at work, twice at home maybe, because they're doing a disproportionate share of the work. So it's this dual burden, if anything else. But recognizing that women who didn't yet have children in the focus groups that we participated in, maybe weren't even thinking about having children, talked about a lot of the barriers in their work to them even considering having children. And so service sector workers in particular talked about their schedule variability, the fact that they're effectively always on call because they might need to go cover a shift for someone else, and the unpredictability of their schedules because they only get them sometimes a week in advance, and so they can't rearrange to do anything, and they're working odd shifts or odd hours too. We did a focus group of just service sector workers, and none of them said that they were thinking about having children in the near future because of the constraints that they see at work. They didn't understand how they would balance motherhood or being a parent with the type of work that they're engaging in. And so in a country where our death rate is higher than our birth rates, where we're seeing new restrictions on immigration, those are the ways that populations grow. And so if we have an entire generation, or at least a segment of the population, that's considering not having children because of barriers at work, we need to look at work as maybe a reason why we don't see the types of population growth or the increases in birth rates that some policymakers are interested in seeing.
Wow, that says a lot. How did that go in the focus group?
There were a lot of younger women who were, all right, let me step back for a second. So in the focus group, we asked women about their work-life balance, and virtually every woman said that they bear most of the burden of the family life, that they reported that they work harder than their husbands because they have to do their paid work, and then they have to come home and be the primary parent and manage the household and manage the kids, and also then manage elderly parents. And it was noted that children grow up or children get sick, and so you have a child and somebody has to stay home with the child when the child is sick, and that, say, for public school teachers, that's more often the mom who would stay home rather than the dad who would stay home. And so those are ways that at work you're sort of getting penalized for being a lower performer because you're having to take sick days or personal days because your child is sick. And then it also was very notable how many women felt really overwhelmed by their life, that they had to go to work and then they had to come home and work like basically another shift. And I'll just read you, if I could, some quotes from some.
Please.
One woman said, "I get very little sleep. I'm holding on like a thread. And I work with vulnerable people, so I have to perform really well at work. And then it's very draining. And when I come home, I don't have what I need at home." Another woman said, "Juggling is hard, and it never gets to an equilibrium, depending on a sick kid or a sick parent." Another person used this sort of analogy. She said, "I show up at work with a full matchbook." She's obviously a little bit older because she's talking about matches. You
right?
might remember. A full matchbook. She said, "But every step takes a match, and by the time you get to your own time, you have 0 matches left because someone has ripped those out of you, and no one is filling our cup back up. I do my job, but also do children, grocery, cooking. We don't get recognized for what it takes, for what that takes away from us, from taking away our these matches." I like that sort of analogy.
I like ripped out.
Ripped out.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's some powerful words there.
And then, we heard from a number of younger participants who were in the focus groups with these older women, and they said, "Well, this is why I would never have a child, because I have to have a job. I have to have a job because I have to pay my bills and I have to earn an income, and I don't want to have that burden of managing my job and my family." And as Rusty said, that's a very societal, long-term concerning problem that we need to be thinking about.
And I think it's important to create some context around this. I mean, the workplace is historically somewhat of a hostile place. And any changes that have been made, any progressive changes to make it a more inclusive, healthier, safer, fair place has been at the demand of workers, which, we'll talk about the importance of labor unions and collective bargaining in a minute. But so this has always been a struggle. And when women enter in the workplace, historically they entered in specific roles. They worked in low-paying factory, dangerous work, life-threatening work. And as time progressed, they started entering into more middle management or higher status work. But this tension of, what their role really is has always been in play. So this idea of being the primary caretaker hasn't changed. We've made more accommodations. We've created family pay leave. We've encouraged, fathers to take time off. We've done several interventions, but at the root, those ideas are really entrenched in our society. So that's why creating these interventions, like unions and pay transparency, are so important, because what we really need to do is transform the workplace into a more hospitable space for working families. Men, women, people who want to have children and procreate and keep the population thriving. We have to make those workspaces more inclusive.
In the report, there is a really stark and very interesting element about unionization. And it almost seems, I guess, counter when you think of traditional, again, stereotypes of the union worker. I'm thinking of my father and my grandfather, union guys here in Erie County. But women seem, according to this report, benefit when it comes to wages, when it comes to being in unions.
Yeah, I'd say, just to follow up on that, everybody benefits when unions are involved. So what we found with Erie County is that being a member of a labor union, or even just being covered by a union CBA, increases wages for everyone. However, there's been a recent trend in the data that we looked at, really since the pandemic era forward, that while wages were being increased for everybody, they were still being increased a little more so for men than women. But everybody, again, was benefiting. Union women were out earning non-union women. Union men were out earning non-union men. But since the pandemic, that's changed. The data that we have for Buffalo Niagara show that the union premium for women workers has actually been a little bit higher than the union premium for men in recent years. That was especially apparent right around 2020. And while we don't have causal data on this, the speculation that we have is, when you look at those prominent industries that we have in Buffalo Niagara and health and social services, those are essential services. Those are frontline jobs that were always active, even during the depths of the economic shutdowns. And those are predominantly women, as we've already argued here for Erie County and Buffalo Niagara. And so women were working more, probably getting paid overtime, especially if they were in a union, because there's a wage book. You know how much you're supposed to be making. Right. You know what the overtime rate is. And so there's that transparency. And why unions are such a valuable piece of maybe solving these gap problems is for that reason. There's transparency in what folks are earning. You know that you have an organization that's going to fight for you to make sure you're getting your overtime pay and that wage theft isn't an issue. And so when you have those supportive infrastructures at work, the results are good for everyone, but they've been particularly good for women, as we've said in the past few years here in Buffalo Niagara.
And again, that's something that might run counter to labor critics, organized labor critics, right? That in a workplace, management doesn't want the union influence in a workplace because it's going to restrict the ability to keep everybody happy, to make sure that everybody's in the roles they want.
Yeah, that's just bunk.
Yeah.
I mean,
thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for using that four-letter word. Yes.
Because, in every part of America, in every workplace that has a union, the wages go up substantially. And that doesn't account for massive increases in benefits. So if you're a member of a labor union and you have a collective bargaining agreement, you see increases in your health care, you see increases in pension contribution, you see better vacation, paid time off. And then unions advocate at the state level and the federal level for changes that we're talking about here, like paid family leave. They understand those are important to working people, and so they advocate in a collective voice, because one person, even we see in these focus groups, one person standing alone can't make a change. But the germ of change comes from, there it goes again, the germ of change, it comes from collectivism, from solidarity.
Yeah.
So, yeah, of course employers are going to say they don't want a union because they have to share profits or find money for workers as opposed to themselves. You know, that's really where we're at. And that's part of what we suggest in our paper is that unionization efforts should be promoted. And, you know, currently at the federal level, they're being decimated. So that's not a good trend.
Yeah, I'm tempted to get into some of the federal trends that we're seeing here, but I don't want to take away from the work inside this report as well.
Can I say one thing
please.
About the fact the federal versus local? So local change has never really been more important, and as data is disappearing, the data that Rusty and Cornell looks at when we do research like this, social science research, as that data is potentially disappearing.
Just explain why you say potentially disappearing. I'd like you to expand on that. If you
Rusty, you want to take that question about what's happening?
A number of the data collection initiatives at the federal level are either in flux. A lot of websites that have hosted data are currently down. Now, there have been researchers out there archiving those past data sets, but there is a lot of uncertainty about whether data that we're going to get in the future is going to look like the data that we've had in the past and allow us to monitor and track the same types of indicators.
Yeah, and just to expand on that just a little bit, we were talking earlier about the Equal Pay Days, and we mentioned how LGBTQIA plus Equal Pay Awareness Day is June 17th, and that's because the data when it comes to sexual orientation is maybe not totally available. And we also hear, certainly on the federal level, that that's a lot of that is going to be perhaps cast away.
Exactly, and that has huge negative implications for equal rights and human rights across the landscape of our society. To your point, the U.S. Census Bureau, through the American Community Survey, had recently started asking a question that helped us identify whether somebody is in a same-sex couple. It doesn't get to their sexual or gender identity specifically, but that's at least one step in the direction where we would be able to potentially look for unequal outcomes or unequal opportunities between different types of individuals. I can't say for sure that we're still going to be asking that question going forward, or if that same sort of data is going to be available from here on out.
And also in the report I did see about support for an equal rights amendment on a federal level. This is more of an anecdotal thing, I think, but it was quite stark.
Oh, yeah. The support for the Equal Rights Amendment is very high among men and women.
Yes.
And I think that goes towards the trend of advancing women's rights, but we're stuck, aren't we? We feel like we're stuck.
It's rigidity. A constitutional amendment takes significant work at the state level, and state legislatures, as we've seen, have been pushed in a certain ideological direction that's maybe opposite of some of the points that we're talking on here recently. And so to think about how the system that we've built would lead to an equal rights amendment at the federal level in the current political landscape, like Cathy said, it's a stuck position.
All the more reason why gender parity in elected office is important, because research has shown that when women are proportionately represented in legislative positions, that women-friendly policies are created and enforced and supported. But that's one of those key factors that are necessary to get us unstuck.
That's a part of the recommendations and other findings inside this report. We got to take one more time out, and we might certainly want to revisit those and get into that before we say goodbye. This is What's Next on Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
This is Jack Cruiser with The Scoreboard on BTPM NPR. Listen during Morning Edition and All Things Considered each Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. For the latest on pro matchups and college rivalries, as well as standout local athletes from Western New York and Southern Ontario. Want more? Listen to a longer version of The Scoreboard at btpm.org or wherever you get your podcasts.
Facts, context, conversation. Your trusted local news source has a new name, but our mission remains the same. BTPM NPR. Explore more at btpm.org or download the BTPM Listen app.
You're listening to What's Next, our place to discuss the important issues of our communities of Western New York and Southern Ontario. We want to hear from you. Click on the Talk to Us option in the BTPM Listen app, and we will work to get your questions or comments on the air. Do you have a story or concern that we should be addressing? Email us using what'snext@btpm.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR.
And welcome back to What's Next. I'm Jay Moran. With me, Cathy Creighton, Rusty Weaver, and Karen King. We've been talking about, looking at the gender pay gap specifically here in Erie County based on a report, Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success. Lots of recommendations coming out of this, and we only have about 10 minutes to go, so there's only so much that we can cover here. But let's get into what that, and you touched on it, Karen, going into break, the idea of political representation. Now, even here in the city of Buffalo, up until just a couple of years ago, actually, I think last year, there were no women on the Common Council. So what about that? And, again, this is our county here. This is our city. But what about recommendations? And when it comes to not just those recommendations, but making it really happen?
Yeah, I think that's important to make note of that. And, of course, the legislature, the Erie County Legislature, has 3 women. We do have a deputy county executive, Lisa Shamera, who's a woman, but we've never had a woman mayor.
We've never had a woman mayor. There's 6 or 7 people running for mayor, and none of them are women.
And let me ask you, Jay, out of the 50 states, how many are governed by women?
How many? Well, I know
guess.
one left one of the Dakotas to join the recent administration. I'll just say 3.
3. There's 12.
12, okay.
Currently, right now, 12 women across the 50 states.
All right.
And, of course, a governor...
So Maine has a
governor, serving as a governor has oftentimes historically been a direct route to candidacy for a president. So it's important to get women involved in politics. It's important to have representation. It is not 100% guarantee that if you have women in office, they'll support pro-women policies, but research has shown that quite often it does make a difference. And it's important because, to Rusty's point, I mean, we're half the working population here in Erie County. We're half the population across the United States. Why wouldn't we have a voice in determining what our laws are going to be, our policies and equal rights amendment ratification, fair pay policies? Why wouldn't we want to have a voice in that?
Other recommendations. How about your group, your focus groups, Cathy?
They as part of going forward, they wanted to have sort of networking kind of opportunities for maybe increasing political awareness, increasing leadership training for themselves, increasing their understanding of where they are and how they can move forward. And that was one of our, in the report, one of our recommendations is to do, for political representation, recruitment initiatives. And we're not sure, we didn't really specify how that would work, but having those opportunities and making women aware, it's very kind of complicated to run for political office. You have to get petition signatures. Right. To be endorsed, you have to have committee members supporting you. So it's not an easy process. My husband's involved in politics, so I have a very, front row seat on how it all works. And I can say that it's not that easy a process to figure out. So understanding, holding courses or classes on how to run for office. And I believe the Partnership for the Public Good does run some courses on how to run for local office, about promoting those kinds of things.
And I'll put in a plug for a program that the Erie County Commission on this Status of Women partners with called First Amendment, First Vote, and that's a program for high school girls to learn about,
that's right. Yep,
learn about the mechanics of running for office and governance. So you got to start early.
Right.
I can jump in too and
Please.
think about a couple of big picture structural things. There's not one solution that's going to take care of all of these problems on all of the fronts where they exist. Things like pay transparency laws and unionization support will erode, I believe, the pay gap over time, and maybe even faster than it's been eroding in the past few decades. But to Karen and Cathy's point, what we really need is culture shift and public education. So number one, I appreciate you having us here to talk about these issues. This is an important forum for something like this.
Right on to public radio.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, yes, that's right. How about that? Thank you for bringing that to the forefront.
But I mean, beyond that, we still need strategies that are going to take care of the disproportionate burdens at home that are creating this double emergency. And because we've learned and we know just inherently that women are doing disproportionately all of the care work, childcare and elder care, systems of universal care will do a lot to take away these problems. Universal childcare, universal elder care, universal health care, those types of major structural systemic changes at the federal level, but if not, even at the state level, we've had state initiatives to try to get to these places before, that will free up women's time and give them more opportunity to advocate for what they need, to organize, to use these forums and to use these networks to go out and to become the leaders that we really need to have these systems in place. Now, the catch-22 is you're probably not going to see those major structural changes unless we have more women in office occupying the decision-making tables and writing and crafting these policies. And so we all have a role to play here. And again, certainly I thank you for inviting us here so that we can have these conversations.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Karen, you were going to
But in addition to the political form, we need more women leaders in the workplace.
Yeah. Right.
Who have the positional power, the C-suite power, if you will, to change policies, to create an environment like one of our focus group members has done, to agree to pay more than a living wage and offer a good benefits package. You know, those leaders have to decide that's the kind of company structure, that's the kind of organization they want to be.
Can I make a plug here for what
Is there another word for public radio? No, go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes.
Yes, support your public radio station.
And everybody does, yeah.
Governor Hochul is a woman, and she is, to our point, has been heavily working towards having universal child care. She has made that a very important part of her policymaking. She's put more money into child care than there was before in New York State, substantially more money. And so that's the kind of, I mean, well, it's definitely not perfect, but it is a move in the right direction. And that's the kind of policymaking change that Karen's talking about, having someone at the highest level of state government pushing for that. Even just talking about it is so heartening for women.
It's interesting you mentioned Governor Hochul, because it's going to transition me into this final question for each of our guests this morning. And we see, Governor Hochul, how she is under duress when it comes to politics in Albany. And we know what's going on in Washington. So I'm going to ask you, when it comes to these recommendations and this issue, do you have hope? Do you have hope moving forward here? What is your thoughts? Well, who wants to take that one first and foremost?
I will. We really want to engage the business community in a much more robust way. Of course, a lot of this has to do with legislation and laws, but it also has to do with people who are invested in business, whether it be a small business owner or a large corporation, a Fortune 500. We all have to come to some kind of consensus of deciding, what kind of environment do we want to create for the people that come in every day and do an honest day's work and are really, for the people that participated in the focus group, passionate about the work they do. And some of the work they do is really hard and undercompensated and underappreciated. So that conversation has to take place with businesses and the business community.
I have a lot of hope, actually, Jay. In talking, well, I'm an eternal optimist, but maybe to a fault. I think based on the focus groups and listening to the intelligent comments of women in those focus groups and understanding where they are and where they need to go really gives me hope. And it was a real pleasure and a real privilege to be able to do this work. Thank you, Erie County. Thank you, Karen King, for allowing us to take this opportunity and at least put a stake in the ground. We know where we are today with equal pay for women in Erie County, and we know how to move forward. And that's the direction we're going in a hopeful and optimistic way.
I appreciate that. How about for you, Rusty?
Yeah, I don't think any of us would be doing this work if there wasn't a reason to be hopeful. I think you're seeing across the country, not just in New York State, a lot of sharpness of economic analysis right now as prices are in flux, as the stock market goes up and down. You're having a lot of folks question the structure of our economy and whether it's working for everyone. And I think you're seeing a lot of people realizing in real time that the answer to that question is no.
And that is probably a good way to finish up this conversation. But this is a great report. Where can people get it?
They can get it a few places. They can go to your Cornell website. They can also get it on Erie County's website, erie.gov, and go to the Commission on the Status of Women, and you can hit a link, and it'll open up the report. And it's free and available to everybody.
And if you want to do a search, go right now. Lower Pay and Greater Barriers to Success. With us this morning, Karen King, Commissioner of Public Advocacy and Executive Director of the Erie County Commission on the Status of Women. Also, the authors of this report, Cathy Creighton, Director, ILR Buffalo CoLab, Cornell University. Rusty Weaver, Director of Research, ILR Buffalo CoLab, Cornell University. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you, Jay.
This is Buffalo Toronto Public Media, NPR, WBFO, and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WUBJ Jamestown, and WOLN Olean, your NPR station.
Support for WBFO and What's Next comes from our members and from Health Foundation for Western and Central New York, where racial and socioeconomic health equity are prioritized. Learn more about building healthier neighborhoods at hfwcny.org.